They built roads that are still standing today. They created laws that continue to guide our societies. But when it came to the battlefield, the Romans were on a completely different level. They weren't just fighters. They were planners, thinkers, and masters of strategy. At times, their methods were so harsh and so unexpected that they didn't just win battles. They broke the will of their opponents. This was no ordinary army. It was a force built on discipline, fear, and exact precision. A machine of war that didn't simply fight harder, it fought smarter. Most enemies never understood what was happening until it was too late. In this video, we reveal the secrets behind some of the Roman army's most shocking battle tactics, the ones that left the ancient world stunned. Before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss stories like this. One of the most incredible tactics was the testudo formation, often called the human tank of the Roman army. It was so effective that it looked more like a moving machine than a line of soldiers. The name testudo means tortoise in Latin, and once you saw it in action, the reason was clear. Picture this. Rows of Roman soldiers advancing slowly, their shields locked tightly together. The front was covered with shields, the sides were covered, and even the top was sealed off. From a distance, it looked like a giant armored shell moving forward, built out of men and iron. Why was it so frightening? Because almost nothing could break it. Arrows rained down, but they bounced off. Spears struck, but they couldn't pierce it. Rocks were useless. Even fire couldn't reach the soldiers inside. Enemies watched in fear as this wall of shields crept closer and closer, unstoppable. And when the Romans finally reached striking distance, the formation would open up. Soldiers drew their swords and launched a powerful attack. The testudo wasn't just strong, it was smart. Roman commanders relied on it, especially during sieges when troops had to cross open ground under heavy missile fire. The shields protected them all the way to the enemy's walls. There are even accounts that the formation was strong enough to carry wagons or horses on top. Imagine an entire platform resting on a formation of soldiers moving forward underneath. That was more than just protection. That was total dominance. But like every tactic, the testudo had its limits. The testudo had one major weakness. It was slow. Very slow. And if enemies managed to get close enough, the formation could be broken apart. The soldiers inside couldn't fight properly while their shields were locked in position. A well-timed cavalry charge or an attack from archers striking from both sides could turn the tortoise into a trap. Still, for most opponents, this was something completely new. They had never witnessed anything like it before. Many were so shocked by the sight that they lost their nerve. Some even ran before the Romans reached them. The testudo wasn't only about protection, it sent a message loud and clear. We are coming, and nothing you do will stop us. So here's the question. Would you have held your ground against that living wall, or turned and run for your life? Triple line system. Rome's unstoppable waves. The next Roman tactic was even more frightening. A wall of warriors that didn't just fight once, but kept attacking again and again. This was the Roman triple line system, known as the Aces triplex. It was one of the most brilliant and devastating formations the ancient world had ever seen. The Roman army moved into position. Dust filled the air, commands rang out across the battlefield. Thousands of soldiers stood ready, arranged like pieces on a giant game board. But this wasn't a simple line of men. It was 3 lines deep, designed to grind the enemy down step by step, without pause and without mercy. At the very front stood the hastati, young, tough, and eager to charge. Behind them were the principes, older and more battle-tested. And at the rear stood the triarii, hardened veterans, calm and silent, waiting for the moment they were truly needed. 3 lines, 3 chances, 3 stages of fury. But what made this formation so deadly wasn't just its numbers. It was the timing. The Romans never sent everyone charging at once. Instead, they began with the velites, the light troops. These men ran ahead, hurled their spears, fired arrows, and then slipped back through the gaps in the line. Next came the hastati, launching their full attack. If they couldn't finish the fight, they pulled back through the openings. The Principes then stepped forward fresh and ready. And if the battle dragged on to the point where the Triarii had to move, it meant the fight was desperate. The Romans even had a saying, "It has come to the Triarii." It was a warning that the situation had reached its breaking point. But even then, there was no panic. The system was designed for endurance. Soldiers rotated in and out like a machine, never giving the enemy a chance to breathe. Imagine standing against that. Just when you thought you had beaten the front line, another fresh force appeared, disciplined, organized, and ready to kill. And then came another line, and sometimes even another. The best part? The formation could adapt to almost any situation. Whether it was flat plains, rough hills, or thick forests, it made no difference. The Romans always had a plan. Thanks to the gaps between their units, they could shift position, retreat, and form up again without falling into chaos. It wasn't just a fighting force. It was like a living war machine. The wedge, how Rome broke armies in half. One of the most feared Roman formations was known as the wedge. To the eye, it looked like a triangle of soldiers, narrow at the front and wide at the back. But this was far more than a shape. It was a weapon made of men, shields, and relentless strength. Commanders called for the wedge when they needed to smash straight through enemy lines. Imagine an opposing army standing shoulder to shoulder, thinking their solid wall was unbreakable. Then the wedge struck, fast, sharp, and unstoppable. At the very tip of the wedge were the strongest, most skilled fighters. Their job was to hit first and hit hardest. Behind them, rank after rank of soldiers pressed forward, adding more and more weight. The front line never stopped. As the wedge pushed in deeper, its sides spread outward, tearing open gaps in the enemy's formation. Just as a wooden wedge splits a log apart, the Roman wedge split entire armies. This tactic was used when breaking the line was the key to victory. At the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC, Roman wedges drove into the famous Macedonian phalanx, a formation once considered unbeatable, and ripped it apart. At the Battle of Watling Street, when the Romans were outnumbered by Boudicca's rebel army, the wedge helped secure their survival. After stopping the initial enemy charge with volleys of spears, the Romans formed into wedges and advanced. They didn't just hold their ground, they punched through it. The wedge wasn't only effective, it was shocking. Most armies of the time relied on straight, rigid lines and sheer numbers, hoping to overwhelm opponents with size alone. But the wedge ignored numbers. It relied on precision, force, and momentum. It didn't clash head-on. It pierced through the enemy's heart. One moment, the opposing army had a strong, unbroken front. The next, their line was cut in half, with Roman soldiers pouring through the center. Confusion followed instantly. Troops didn't know whether to keep fighting, to run, or to regroup. And while they hesitated, the wedge kept driving forward, silent and unstoppable. It wasn't flashy, but it was deadly. The corvus, turning sea, battles into land battles. The Romans were famous for their battlefield tactics, but their ingenuity also reached the seas. One of their most surprising and shocking inventions was the corvus, a massive wooden boarding bridge that transformed naval encounters into hand-to-hand combat. The word corvus means crow or raven in Latin. The name came from the sharp iron spike fixed to the end of the bridge, shaped like a bird's beak. This wasn't decoration. It was designed to bite deep into an enemy deck and hold two ships together. At the start of the First Punic War, Rome had almost no naval experience. Carthage, in contrast, commanded one of the strongest fleets in the Mediterranean, with highly skilled and fast crews. Rome needed a way to fight at sea without relying on sailing expertise. Their solution? Turn sea battles into land battles. The corvus measured about 11 meters long and a little over 1 meter wide. It was mounted on the front of Roman ships and operated using ropes and pulleys. When an enemy vessel drew near, the bridge was dropped, the spike slammed into the deck, and the ships locked together. Roman soldiers, trained for land combat, then rushed across and fought in close quarters. Carthaginian sailors never expected this. They were masters of naval speed and maneuvering, not sword fighting. Suddenly, their greatest advantage, mobility, was useless. With the corvus in place, the Romans treated enemy ships like battlegrounds. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 BC, the corvus secured Rome's first major naval victory. 30 Carthaginian ships were captured, and their crews had no escape from brutal Roman attacks. Later, at the Battle of Ecnomus in 256 BC, the corvus proved its worth again. Despite Carthage's superior maneuvering, they lost over 90 ships as Roman legions boarded and overwhelmed them. The effect was shocking. Naval battles were expected to be contests of wind, speed, and ramming tactics. The Romans broke that rule. They brought shields, swords, and discipline onto the waves. The corvus, however, had weaknesses. It was heavy, slowed the ships, and could not be used in rough seas. Over time, as Roman sailors gained more experience, it became less necessary. Still, for a brief but decisive period, this strange and brutal bridge gave Rome control of the waters and turned fear into victory. Feigned retreat, Rome's most deceptive trick. Another tactic, the feigned retreat, proved just as dangerous, not through strength, but through cunning. At first glance, it looks like defeat. Soldiers turn their backs and begin to run. The enemy cheers, believing victory is at hand, and rushes forward. But what they don't realize is that it's all part of the trap. A feigned retreat was a clever tactic where a force pretended to flee. The purpose was simple: lure the enemy out, make them overconfident, and pull them into chaos. Then, at just the right moment, the retreating troops would halt, turn around, and strike back. Pulling. This oft demanded more than bravery. It required strict discipline. Soldiers had to look like they were beaten without actually losing formation. When done correctly, the effect was devastating. The Romans first experienced this tactic in 262 BC during the First Punic War, near the city of Agrigentum in Sicily. The Carthaginian commander Hanno ordered his Numidian cavalry to engage briefly, then fall back as if they were defeated. The Romans believed the ruse. Their cavalry gave chase, eager for an easy kill. But instead of victory, they rode straight into an ambush. Hanno's main army was waiting, and the Romans suffered heavy losses. The defeat was crushing not only for the numbers lost, but also for the humiliation of being tricked. Another brutal example came in 221 BC. The Greek commander Zenoetas, fighting for the Seleucid king Antiochus III, marched against the rebel Molon in Media. Molon pretended to retreat, drawing Zenoetas across a river. Believing the battle was over, the Seleucid soldiers relaxed. Some even began drinking. Then, without warning, Molon's army returned in full force. Zenoetas was killed, and his entire army was wiped out. Even Rome's enemies in Iberia mastered this tactic. The Lusitanians were especially skilled. In 153 BC, their leader Caesarus tricked a Roman army led by Lucius Mummius with a false retreat, crushing his forces. Later, the famous Lusitanian commander Viriathus would use the same maneuver again and again, outsmarting Roman generals who should have known better. Why was this tactic so shocking? Because it attacked the enemy's mind. It made them believe they had already won, only to turn triumph into disaster. Pride turned into panic. Strength collapsed into confusion. Walls within walls. Caesar's genius at Alesia. Years later, under the command of Julius Caesar, the Romans themselves would pull off one of the most ambitious siege tactics in history. It happened in 52 BC, at a place called Alesia. The Gallic leader Vercingetorix had taken refuge inside a fortified hilltop city with thousands of warriors. Most generals would have tried to storm the place, but not Caesar. Instead of a direct attack, Caesar chose patience and engineering. First, he ordered his legions to surround Alesia completely. He wanted no one to get out and no help to get in. To make that happen, he built a massive line of fortifications. This was known as a circumvallation. It stretched for 16 kilometers, or about 10 miles, forming a complete ring of ditches, wooden walls, towers, and traps that surrounded the enemy. Along this massive line stood 23 towers, each filled with Roman archers and slingers ready to strike if the Gauls tried to break free. But Caesar didn't stop with just one wall. He knew that Vercingetorix had already sent riders to call for help. To prepare for reinforcements, Caesar ordered another wall to be built, this time facing outward. This second ring was called a contravallation, designed to shield the Romans from attacks coming from outside. In effect, Caesar had trapped his enemy between two deadly barriers, sealing them in like a pot under a lid. The engineering detail was astonishing. Roman soldiers dug trenches, some filled with water to stop cavalry. Others were reinforced with sharpened stakes. Behind these stood tall wooden walls topped with battlements and spikes. Hidden pits and traps were also placed in front to slow down charging forces. When the land wasn't flat, Caesar came up with another solution. He ordered the construction of a massive earthen ramp, creating a depression in the ground that allowed siege towers to roll forward. The result was complete containment. There was no way out for those inside, and no way in for those outside. Vercingetorix waited for his allies to break through, but when reinforcements arrived, they found themselves blocked by the outer fortifications. The Gauls inside tried to fight their way out. The Gauls outside tried to force their way in. Both attempts failed. The double wall strategy worked flawlessly. It left Rome's enemies stunned. Who would build two walls for one siege? Caesar did, and with this move, he crushed the last major resistance in Gaul. After this, Rome faced other terrifying challenges. Some states relied on war elephants in battle. The Romans rarely used them, but they developed powerful tactics to defeat them. These strategies turned fear into control. War elephants were a nightmare on the battlefield. Massive, fast, and seemingly unstoppable. Their thick hides made them difficult to kill, and their sheer size allowed them to trample soldiers and horses with ease. During the Pyrrhic Wars and the Punic Wars, Roman legions encountered them up close and nearly broke under their power. But Rome adapted. Once they figured out how to counter elephants, these massive beasts stopped being unbeatable. The first rule was simple: never face them head-on. Instead of charging at the front, Roman soldiers went for weak spots like the legs and the eyes, places that were much harder to protect. Spears, arrows, and quick-side attacks became their main weapons. Troops would wait for the perfect moment, strike fast, and then move aside before the elephant could crush them. Next, the Romans changed the way they formed their lines. Rather than staying tightly packed, they opened narrow gaps in their ranks. When the elephants charged, they ran straight through the passages instead of smashing through the entire army. Once the animals ended up behind the main line, confused and isolated, the Romans surrounded and cut them down. They also learned to use the elephant's own fear against it. For all their size and strength, elephants were still animals, and animals can panic. One of the strangest Roman tricks involved so-called fire pigs. These were pigs covered in tar or pitch, set ablaze, and then released toward the charging elephants. The terrifying squeals, combined with the sight and smell of fire, sent the elephants into a frenzy. In panic, they often turned around and stormed back into their own side, trampling friendly troops and spreading chaos. Brutal and horrifying, but effective. To block charges before they even began, the Romans dug trenches and filled them with sharp stakes. These defenses wounded or slowed the elephants, keeping them from doing major damage. Two famous battles showed just how well these tactics worked. At the Battle of Beneventum in 275 BC, the Romans defeated Pyrrhus of Epirus by using open passages and coordinated side attacks. Pyrrhus may have claimed victory, but the losses were so devastating he reportedly said, "One more victory like this, and I am undone." At the Battle of Zama in 202 BC, Scipio Africanus left deliberate gaps in his lines. When Hannibal's elephants charged, they missed their targets and stampeded back into the Carthaginian army. That chaos gave Rome the upper hand and led to the end of the Second Punic War. Rome's enemies were stunned. They realized the legions were not just strong because of their weapons or formations, but because of something far more dangerous: discipline. And nothing showed this better than one of Rome's most feared punishments, decimation. Decimation meant that 1 out of every 10 soldiers in a unit was executed, chosen by lot. It didn't matter if a man had fought bravely or not. If luck turned against a soldier, he died, not by an officer's blade, but at the hands of his 9 closest comrades. They were forced to carry out the execution themselves. This punishment, called decimation, was only used in the most extreme cases: mutiny, desertion, or outright cowardice. Roman generals understood that fear could be just as effective as any weapon. If one man ran during battle, panic could spread quickly. Decimation made sure no one dared. The method was cruel. A unit was divided into groups of 10. Each group drew lots. The unlucky soldier was beaten or stabbed to death by the other 9. And it didn't end there. The survivors were humiliated. Further, forced to live on reduced rations, sometimes only barley instead of wheat, and ordered to sleep outside the safety of the camp. Their disgrace was total, but the message was clear. Decimation was rare, but when carried out, it sent shockwaves through the army, and even through Rome's enemies. Soldiers might have feared dying in combat, but the fear of failing their commander was even greater. One of the most infamous examples came during the Third Servile War, when Roman general Crassus failed to defeat Spartacus. Furious at his men, he ordered a decimation. Hundreds were killed, not by the enemy, but by their own brothers in arms. Later, Mark Antony used it too, after a disastrous defeat in Media left his soldiers demoralized. Even early in the Republic, commanders like Appius Claudius had relied on decimation to force obedience during the Volscian Wars. For Rome's enemies, the idea was shocking: soldiers killing each other on command. But this was exactly what made Rome so feared. It showed how far they were willing to go for order, control, and loyalty. So which of these Roman tactics do you find the most shocking? The Roman legions mastered war not just with weapons and numbers, but with discipline, strategy, and sometimes terrifying ingenuity. Have you heard of other military tactics that pushed the limits like these? Share your thoughts below, and let's keep uncovering the genius and brutality of the armies that shaped history. See you in the next one.